The moment I stepped into the private dining room, I knew the night had been staged for something other than cake and candles. Half the faces were turned toward their phones, glow pooling under chins like small spotlights. And even the waiter poured champagne with a careful sidelong glance. Trevor rose before I reached my chair. Glass lifted his phone still in his other hand, as though the toast required evidence. The room quieted, the silverware still, the air chilled by the hum of quiet curiosity, and the first words he chose tasted like metal in my mouth. How lucky I was to have him, how he taught me to live in the real world. Nervous laughter skittered along the table, skimming over my birthday, like a pebble tossed across a lake, and I felt my smile harden into something I could not swallow. Across from me, Nate's jaw set, and I watched a vein tick in his temple, the way it did when he was holding back. Trevor took a breath like a performer between lines, and the door eased open behind him, letting in the sleek click of heels and a flicker of red silk. It was only a ripple in the light, a perfume that did not belong to me, but the room leaned toward it as if it knew a second act was waiting. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and if you've ever felt a moment in your gut when celebration turned into truth. Like and subscribe if you want more stories where dignity wins in the end. My name is Grace Whitmore, 28 years old, and most days I wear a quiet life, like a well-fitted coat. Nothing loud, nothing sloppy, just steadiness that lets me sleep at night. After my parents passed, I took over the portfolio that holds our ranch land and the energy stakes that have supported this family for 3 generations. The sort of responsibility that does not forgive impulse. I grew up on fence lines and early mornings, the kind that smell like cedar and dust, and I was taught that money isn't decoration, it's stewardship. When the lawyers finished their condolences and spreadsheets, I promised myself I would keep the Whitmore name clean and the doors open for the cousins who come after me. Trevor arrived in my life with a charisma that felt like fresh air, saying he admired a woman who knew her numbers and still remembered where she came from. He wasn't a Dallas society son with an inherited smile. He was a builder, or so he said. Startups, expansions, a gym concept, a tech app, each idea pressed into my palm like a shiny coin. I was drawn to his certainty, the way he filled a room with plans, and I mistook volume for substance more than once. When he asked me to marry him, he said we'd be partners, and I heard the word exactly the way I wanted to equal. The surface harmony held, at least at first. We hosted quiet dinners, I set early alarms, he took late meetings, and our calendars fit together like gears that never quite touched. On weekends, we drove out to the ranch, and I watched the horizon steady me, while Trevor paced the porch with calls that always seemed to run just a little too long. He teased me for keeping paper ledgers as backups, and I teased him for ignoring receipts, and somewhere in those small jokes were the outlines of who we were becoming. My family values were simple and unfashionable. Keep your word, count twice, and never spend $1 you can't explain. Trevor's world was different, leaning on appearance and momentum, the kind that treats optimism like collateral. He loved telling me I was too cautious, that I had the heart of a lion and the brakes of a church bus, and I laughed because I thought it was a compliment. The truth is, I wanted marriage to be a place where I could set down my guard for a while and be held by someone who meant it. There were early signs I put back on the shelf because I wanted to believe in us. A tuxedo rental that didn't match our calendar, a room service charge at a hotel we had never stayed in, a cologne that wasn't his, and a perfume that wasn't mine, all of it tucked into white-lipped explanations delivered with a kiss on the forehead. He said investors liked late dinners, and I told myself a builder must build somewhere even at midnight. When my brother asked if I was sure, I told him yes, and didn't let my voice waver. I became my parents' daughter in the ways that mattered. I watched, I waited, I saved, and I learned to trust a silence more than a speech. The months leading to that birthday dinner were busy with audits. Audits I initiated under the polite excuse of year-end housekeeping, and I remember feeling grateful for spreadsheets because they do not flinch. Nothing concrete surfaced then, not yet just a rhythm that felt offbeat, the way a song you know by heart sounds strange if one note slips. And so the celebration was set a private room with white linen and small vases of bluebonnets. Because I'm sentimental like that, and the guest list was meant to be family and a few friends who knew the difference between gossip and care. I had chosen a dress my mother would have liked, something simple that let me feel like myself, and I told Trevor all I wanted was a toast about the future, not the kind that plays to a crowd. He smiled and said he had it handled, and I believed him because I wanted to. I had barely drawn breath from the shock when the woman in red crossed the dining room like it belonged to her. The low murmur of silverware and whispers died, replaced by the pointed rhythm of heels on polished marble. She didn't hesitate, not for 1 second. She walked right past my family, right past the stunned faces of my friends, and positioned herself beside Trevor as if it had been rehearsed. Her perfume spread across the room, sharp and sweet, and it carried with it the undeniable truth she knew exactly what she was doing. The room was so silent, I could hear the faint chime of the chandelier swaying overhead. The woman Sloane Vega, though I only learned her name in that instant, rested one manicured hand on the back of a chair and raised her chin. "You told me tonight was the night you'd make it official," she said, her voice steady and biting, as if she'd been waiting her entire life to announce her presence. My chest felt hollow. My fingers tightened around the stem of my glass until I thought it might snap. All eyes shifted to Trevor, and instead of panic, I saw the glimmer of a smile tugging at his lips. "This is Sloane," he announced, letting the name drop like a match into dry grass. His tone was casual, almost triumphant. "She's been with me for a while now, and since Grace has more than enough to go around, it's only fair Sloane gets her share too." His words burned as they spread through the room, leaving me stripped under the weight of so many stares. Nate's chair scraped the floor beside me, his knuckles white as he gripped the table, but I lifted my hand slightly, stopping him before he could explode. My humiliation didn't need his fury. It had already found its spotlight. Sloane leaned closer, eyes fixed on me with a venomous edge. "You can drop the act, Grace. Everyone knows you're just the daughter of oil stocks and a ranch empire. Trevor deserves more than a spoiled wife hiding behind a trust fund." Her laughter followed high and thin, echoing against the walls. A few phones angled higher, catching every moment, preserving my ruin in pixels. My mouth was dry, but somehow my voice found its way through. "You walk into my birthday party, stand beside my husband, and dare to demand something from me." The words came louder than I expected, carrying across the table like a whip crack. I rose from my chair, and for the first time since the night had begun, silence belonged to me. My heels cut against the floor as I circled toward Trevor, my gaze locked on his faltering smirk. "Let me make something perfectly clear," I said, my voice steady despite the shaking in my hands. "You will never touch $1 of my inheritance. Not a penny, not a breath." The room gasped. Nate's muttered, "That's right," floated across the table, but I barely heard it. I was too focused on Trevor's face, watching his confidence flicker like a candle in the wind. Sloane's laugh rose again. "He told me there's no prenup. Everything you own is community property, sweetheart. You'll be splitting it with us soon enough." The certainty in her tone might have shaken me months ago, but not that night. I stepped close enough to Trevor that I could see the pulse in his neck, quick and unsteady. "There's a prenup," I said, my words sharp as steel. "An ironclad one. Signed, sealed, and notarized. And the only thing you'll be sharing with her is the bill for every fantasy you've spun." My voice cracked the silence, and I felt the room tilt toward me. Not him. Trevor reached out suddenly, maybe to steady himself, maybe to reel me back in. But I slapped his hand away with a force that echoed louder than I expected. The sound filled the room final and sharp, and his face flushed crimson. "You've mocked my family, my name, and the legacy I've protected," I told him, meeting his eyes without a flicker. "But tonight is the last time you'll ever stand above me." I didn't wait for a reply. I turned, walked past the white tablecloths and stunned expressions, and pushed through the glass doors into the Dallas night. The air outside was cool, slicing through the heat of my skin. My vision blurred, tears threatening, but I refused to let them fall. Not there. Not yet. The muffled chaos from inside the restaurant trailed behind me, a dull roar fading as I stepped farther from it. I lifted my chin, every step heavier but steadier, like I was carrying both the humiliation and the promise of something greater. By the time I reached the sidewalk, I knew with absolute clarity what had just happened. Trevor and Sloane hadn't humiliated me, they'd freed me. They had lit the fire themselves, and I would be the one to make sure they burned in it. For days, I'd brushed off small signs. Receipts folded into his jacket pocket from places I'd never been, nights that stretched into dawn, with the excuse of business calls and perfumes that clung to his shirt like shadows that weren't mine. I had confronted him before, but his smooth words wrapped around my doubts until I felt foolish for asking. He told me investors liked the late hours, that clients preferred hotels for convenience, that I was too suspicious. And I let it go, convincing myself marriage was about trust, about patience, about waiting for the man you love to catch up to the image you hold of him. What I hadn't told anyone was how many times I'd sat in our kitchen alone with my ledger books and cooling coffee, wondering if the silence between us was the kind that could still be repaired. I wanted children running across the same ranch fields I grew up in, wanted family dinners that meant something, wanted to believe loyalty was stronger than temptation. But loyalty requires two hearts pulling in the same direction, and mine had been dragging his dead weight long enough. I just hadn't admitted it until Sloane's crimson dress cut through the room like a warning flare. That night on the sidewalk, I clenched my fists and promised myself something I hadn't dared to say before. This was not the end of me. It was the beginning of them paying for everything they had done. I would not crumble into whispers and gossip, not with a prenup signed in ink and the Whitmore legacy written in stone, long before Trevor Hale ever smiled his way into my life. He thought he had embarrassed me beyond repair. He thought flaunting his mistress would make me small. But all he had done was open a door I was finally ready to walk through. And so as I stepped into the quiet night, the neon lights of Dallas buzzing faintly in the distance, I realized I had something more powerful than shock or tears. I had resolve. Trevor and Sloane wanted a show, but they had no idea the curtain had only just risen. When I closed the restaurant doors behind me that night, the cool air steadied me for only a moment. By the time I reached my car, the weight of humiliation pressed down so heavily that I could barely lift my hands to the steering wheel. My chest burned with a mixture of rage and shame, but I would not let myself collapse into tears where anyone could see. Not outside a room full of whispers phones and the smug faces of Trevor and Sloane. I drove home with the city lights blurring past, my heart pounding louder than the tires on the asphalt, wondering how the man I had once trusted more than anyone had turned into a stranger, willing to destroy me in front of everyone I loved. That night, I lay awake in our bed, staring at the ceiling fan as it creaked in the darkness. The silence was suffocating. Every memory of Trevor's excuses replayed itself with painful clarity. Receipts from hotels he had no business visiting, shirts that smelled faintly of perfume I didn't wear, business trips that stretched too long. Each time I had asked him about it, he made me feel like a suspicious wife who didn't understand how the world worked. He stroked my hair, told me I worried too much, told me men like him needed late nights to build empires. And I believed him because I wanted to, because I couldn't bear to think the vows we made meant so little to him. In the kitchen the next morning, my brother Nate found me sitting at the table with cold coffee, my ledger book open but untouched. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there watching me for a long moment, his jaw set in the same way it had been at the restaurant when he nearly lunged across the table. Finally, he pulled out a chair and sat down. "Grace," he said softly, "you can't keep pretending he's someone he's not." His words cracked something inside me, though. I managed to keep my voice steady when I asked, "Do you think I don't already know?" What hurt wasn't just the affair. It was the realization that I had been shrinking myself for years to make space for Trevor's ambition. I had passed up the chance to take leadership roles in the family businesses so that he could pursue ideas that never reached the ground. I had poured time, money, and trust into ventures that dissolved into nothing, while telling myself marriage meant sacrifice. My parents had raised me to protect what they built to safeguard the Whitmore name and ensure every cousin after me had their share. Yet I had bent those values in ways they never would have all to support a man who repaid me with lies. The final confirmation came from someone who never should have been the one to give it. My cousin Maya was at school when my younger sister Caroline showed up at my house. Caroline had fire in her eyes when I opened the door, but there was pity behind it too. She didn't waste time. She pulled her phone from her purse and laid it on the table. Photos glowed from the screen, Trevor with Sloane, his arm around her waist, the two of them stepping out of a hotel as if they had nothing to hide. My vision blurred as I stared at the images, my throat tightening so much I could hardly breathe. Caroline reached for my hand, but I pulled back, afraid that if she touched me, I would crumble. Deep down, I realized I didn't need those photos to know. The truth had been living under my roof for far too long. I wanted to scream, to shatter the glass doors, and fill the house with sound until there was nothing left inside me. Instead, I sat in silence, holding onto the phone like it weighed more than steel. I felt like a fool for every night I'd chosen to believe him, for every doubt I'd buried, so he wouldn't accuse me of being paranoid. Caroline's voice cut through my spiraling thoughts. "You don't deserve this, Grace. Not you." Her words shook me because part of me had started to believe I did deserve it, that maybe loving too fiercely and trusting too blindly had brought me to this place. That night, alone again, I wandered through the house gathering small things that mattered to me. My mother's quilt, my father's pocket watch, the leather-bound ledgers that held every investment and every careful note. Each object felt like a reminder of who I was before Trevor, who I still was beneath the layers of humiliation he had piled onto me. Standing in the quiet of our bedroom, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. My eyes were red, my shoulders slumped, but somewhere in the reflection, I recognized a woman who had not been broken yet. The following days were a blur of doubt and exhaustion. I went through the motions, meetings, calls, ranch accounts, while Trevor stumbled in and out of the house with his hollow excuses. He carried himself as though nothing had changed, as though my silence meant forgiveness. But I wasn't silent because I forgave him. I was silent because I was waiting. I needed to gather myself to collect every shard of strength because I knew this wasn't just about a marriage falling apart. This was about defending everything my parents left behind, everything I had sworn to protect. One evening after Trevor left for yet another business dinner, I sat at the kitchen table with the ledgers spread out before me. I traced the ink of my father's handwriting, in the margins his steady script reminding me that Whitmores did not bow to deceit. I whispered aloud, "I will not let him take this from me." The sound of my own voice startled me, but it steadied me too. For the first time since my birthday, I felt a spark of clarity. I realized then that humiliation was only the surface wound. The deeper pain came from the years of bending the quiet compromises that had eroded who I was. I had traded my instincts for his charm, my caution for his promises. I had built my life around a man who never planned to honor it. That truth hurt more than the public betrayal, because it meant I had betrayed myself by ignoring what I already knew. As the night wore on, I wrote down a list, not of losses, but of what I still held. Assets in my name, property deeds, accounts tied to the Whitmore Trust. The prenup Trevor thought didn't exist. Each line I wrote was like reclaiming a piece of myself, proof that while he had humiliated me, he hadn't destroyed me. Not yet. I closed the book with trembling hands, but instead of weakness, the tremor felt like a fuse being lit. I knew the days ahead would be filled with confrontation, with choices that would test me in ways I hadn't faced before. But as I looked out the window at the dark stretch of ranch land under the Texas sky, I felt something shift inside me. I was done waiting for Trevor to change. I was done shrinking. When dawn spread across the ranch the morning after Caroline showed me those photos, I felt a clarity that cut sharper than grief. The humiliation had burned me hollow, but in its place came a fire I couldn't ignore. I had lived for years bending around Trevor's schemes, trying to hold on to the image of loyalty and partnership I once believed in. But that woman had disappeared with the sound of Sloane's heels in the dining room, and what remained was someone who needed to act. I poured myself a black coffee, opened my notebook, and began listing every asset, account, and deed in my name. The first call I made was to Arthur Phelps. He had been my parents' attorney for decades, and I trusted him more than I trusted most of my own blood. His voice was calm when I explained what had happened, but beneath the measured tone, I heard steel. Grace, the prenuptial agreement you signed is airtight. He cannot touch what belongs to you, not a penny. I closed my eyes in relief, though the weight on my chest remained. Arthur didn't stop there. The most important thing now is to move quickly. We need to freeze access before he tries to maneuver. By noon, my signature was on every document Arthur placed in front of me. Our joint accounts were closed. Credit lines with Trevor's name attached were dissolved. Cards that had once passed smoothly across counters would now fail with every attempt. I imagined him trying to buy drinks or pay for a dinner, only to be met with the sting of rejection, and for the first time since the party, the corner of my mouth lifted. It wasn't joy, it was resolve. That evening, movers arrived at the house. I had already sorted what mattered: clothes, jewelry, family heirlooms, the records that traced every Whitmore investment back generations. Everything else I left behind. I watched as boxes stacked neatly inside the truck, each one filled with something that carried my parents' memory or my own sense of self. The rest, the furniture, Trevor liked to brag about the oversized television he insisted on buying, the gym equipment he never used, could stay behind as reminders of his empty promises. By the time the sun dipped low, the rooms echoed with absence. Trevor stumbled in near midnight, smelling of whiskey and stale cigar smoke. He loosened his tie as though nothing had changed, his smile careless. "Come on, Grace," he said, tossing his jacket across a chair. "Don't be dramatic. You'll cool down. You always do." My suitcase was by the door, and I stood beside it without flinching. "Not this time," I answered. The words hung between us like glass about to shatter. His smirk faltered, and for the first time, I saw panic flicker in his eyes. "Where are you even going?" he asked, his voice pitched higher than usual. I lifted my coat from the hook and met his gaze. "Somewhere you can't follow. You'll understand tomorrow when your card gets declined at breakfast." He reached for my arm, but I stepped back, my heels firm against the wood floor. The look on his face, confusion, fear, disbelief, was almost worth the years I had wasted. I walked out without slamming the door, sliding into the car, waiting for me outside, and let the house disappear in the rearview mirror. The next few days were a blur of phone calls and signatures. Every business account Trevor had dipped into was closed or redirected. Shares I had once let him manage were pulled back into my name. Lawyers filed paperwork faster than Trevor could leave voicemails on my phone. At first, his messages carried a smug confidence promises that I'd return once I had cooled off. But when the money dried up, his tone shifted. "Grace, this is insane. Call me back. You can't cut me out like this. We can work it out." The desperation in his voice grew sharper with each call, and I stopped listening after the 50th message. 3 days later, Caroline called me laughing. She had run into Trevor at a bar downtown where he tried to pay for drinks with his platinum card, declined twice in front of a crowd of his friends. "He looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole," she said between chuckles. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling for what felt like the first time in weeks. The humiliation he had once pushed onto me was circling back to him, and it was only the beginning. Still, I knew better than to think cutting him off financially would be enough. Trevor thrived on appearances, on convincing people he was a man to admire. If I was going to reclaim what he tried to strip from me, I had to dismantle the illusion too. I had to let the truth breathe in the same spaces where he once boasted. Late one night, as I sat in my quiet apartment surrounded by boxes I hadn't yet unpacked, I whispered to myself, "You started this, Trevor. I'm just finishing it." The fallout came faster than I imagined. By the end of the week, Trevor's name was slipping from polite conversation into pointed gossip. Friends who once fawned over him now whispered about the birthday debacle. At networking events, he became a joke instead of a prospect. At bars, people nudged one another saying, "That's him, the one who got burned." The video clips spread like wildfire, his smug toast. Sloane's interruption, my calm reminder about the prenup. Strangers who had never shaken my hand now treated me like a cautionary tale they respected. Meanwhile, I was busy shaping a plan. Financial locks were only the first step. Social perception would be the second. I wanted the same people who once admired him to see him for who he truly was, reckless, manipulative, and powerless without me. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about restoring balance. Trevor had tried to strip me bare in front of everyone. Now, it was time to let the truth strip him instead. One evening, as the city lights glowed across the skyline outside my new apartment, I poured myself a glass of wine and leaned against the window. The hum of traffic below was steady, unbothered, while my own life shifted into something sharper and steadier. I thought of Maya asleep down the hall, safe in a room filled with her books and drawings. I thought of Nate's steady voice reminding me that I couldn't keep pretending. And I thought of Arthur's firm assurance that the prenup was my shield. Piece by piece, I realized I was building not just a defense, but a strategy. The humiliation was behind me now. What remained was a clear path forward. Trevor believed he had humiliated me beyond repair. But he didn't realize that the woman who had walked away with a suitcase was not broken. She was preparing. The first time I saw Trevor after I left the house was in the unlikeliest place, a restaurant where I had been invited by a friend who wanted to lift my spirits. I had no reason to expect him there, no warning to brace myself yet. The moment I walked through the doors, I felt the air shift. His laughter carried across the room, forced and too loud, the kind that begged for attention. And beside him sat Sloane, dressed in something far too bright for a place that prided itself on elegance. The moment our eyes met, Trevor shot to his feet, raising his glass like it was a stage prop. "Grace," He called, his voice carrying to every corner of the dining room. Care to join us? We were just talking about you. Every face turned in my direction. Forks hovered above plates, conversations paused, and I realized instantly what he wanted: a second performance, another opportunity to twist the story. I steadied myself and walked directly toward his table, my heels clicking against the polished wood floor. If Trevor wanted a spectacle, I would give him one, but on my terms. Talking about me, I asked calmly, resting my hand on the back of a chair. That seems to be your favorite pastime these days. Sloane smirked, swirling her wine, as if she had already won. We were discussing how unfair it is that you're hoarding all the assets, she said smoothly. Trevor deserves better after everything he's given you. I tilted my head, letting my gaze fall over both of them. Everything he's given me, I repeated. Do you mean the debts, the failed ventures, the humiliation in front of my family? Forgive me if I don't consider that generosity. A few tables nearby chuckled quietly, though I didn't shift my eyes from theirs. Trevor leaned forward, lowering his voice, as though the act of whispering gave him control. Grace, you're making a mistake dragging this out. People will talk less if you just settle. Give me what's fair and move on. I slipped my phone from my clutch, tapped the screen, and turned it toward him. The display glowed with screenshots, his text to Sloane, promises of money lies about our marriage. Words too filthy to be mistaken as anything other than betrayal. The color drained from Sloane's face. She gripped the stem of her glass so tightly I thought it might shatter. You told me you deleted those, she hissed under her breath. Trevor's jaw clenched, but the whispers rising around us drowned out any response he might have made. Heads craned closer, phones angled discreetly. The truth was no longer private. It had slipped into the air like smoke, impossible to contain. I leaned in, just enough so only the two of them could hear me. You thought humiliating me would end my story. But this is the moment people will remember. Then, raising my voice so it carried, I said clearly, Trevor Hale doesn't just cheat. He lies, manipulates, and steals. And now, he's out of excuses. The room fell into a heavy silence before someone at the bar began to clap. Others followed the sound, swelling until it was undeniable. Trevor's shoulders stiffened, his eyes darting as if searching for an escape that didn't exist. Sloane shoved her chair back, grabbed her purse, and stormed out her heels, striking against the floor with a rhythm of retreat. Trevor was left standing alone, crimson creeping up his neck, his glass still raised like he couldn't remember how to lower it. I stepped back, straightened my spine, and walked away from the table without another word. Behind me, laughter mixed with whispers feeding on him like crows over something already broken. By the time I slid into the back of the car outside, my phone buzzed with messages. Friends who had been there, acquaintances who had seen it unfold, even strangers who admired the way I had turned the moment on its head. You handled that perfectly, one text read. You destroyed him, said another. I didn't reply, but I allowed myself one long exhale. Trevor had tried to reclaim the narrative, but instead, he had handed me the stage. The following morning, clips of the confrontation had already spread across social media, captioned with phrases like the Prenup Queen and Dallas's quiet powerhouse. Trevor thought he could control how the story was told. Instead, he became the story everyone was laughing at. But he wasn't finished. Trevor never thrived in silence. He needed an audience, even if it meant twisting reality until it snapped. A few days later, his Instagram post appeared. Marriage is complicated, it read. I've made mistakes, but I will always love Grace. Please respect our privacy during this painful time. The hypocrisy was staggering. Privacy from the man who had paraded his mistress into my birthday dinner. The comments tore him apart before I even had to say a word. Didn't you humiliate her at her own party? one wrote. Sit down, Trevor said another. Still he pressed on. 2 mornings later, he appeared on a Dallas television show, seated stiffly in a navy blazer, his eyes glassy, as though rehearsed in the mirror. I watched from my kitchen as he dabbed his face with a tissue, milking the performance for sympathy. Grace is a wonderful woman, he told the host solemnly. But money changes people. When you grow up with everything handed to you, you don't understand struggle. I was suffocating. His voice cracked just enough to suggest tears, but his eyes were bone dry. The host shifted uncomfortably, but Trevor pressed forward, his tissue trembling in his hand. He thought he was playing the role of the wounded husband, painting me as the cold wife who cared only for inheritance. For a brief second, I wondered if anyone might believe him, but the internet has a way of dissecting lies. By evening, the clips were circulating with captions like Oscar-worthy crocodile tears and side-by-side comparisons of his fake sobs with screenshots of his texts to Sloane. Then came the receipts. I hadn't planned to release them myself. I didn't need to. A friend of a friend leaked the folder I had quietly compiled for divorce court. Hotel confirmations, text threads, even audio recordings where Trevor bragged to Sloane. She doesn't even check the statements. I could drain her blind, and she'd still kiss me goodnight. In another, Sloane laughed and asked, "When do I get my condo?" Trevor's voice answered, "Soon, once I get Grace to loosen her grip." Those recordings spread like wildfire. Hashtags trended. Memes appeared overnight. Trevor's face pasted onto soap opera posters. His promises turned into remixed songs that looped endlessly. Everywhere he turned, his name was no longer respected. It was ridiculed. Sloane tried to salvage herself with a shaky video claiming she had never wanted to come between a marriage that Trevor had lied to both of us. But screenshots proved otherwise, and the comments section tore her apart. Within days, she deleted every account she had once used to flaunt her new life. Trevor's world was crumbling faster than he could rebuild it, and the most telling part was that I hadn't posted a single word. The silence was louder than anything he could have imagined. Every time he tried to claw back control, the truth shoved him deeper into the corner he had built for himself. The final crack came when one of his business partners released a statement cutting ties. "We cannot condone behavior that disrespects family and integrity," it read. Effective immediately, Trevor Hale is no longer affiliated with our brand. That one made me pause. It meant the damage wasn't just personal anymore. It was professional. He wasn't just the husband who had humiliated his wife. He was now the man no one wanted to be associated with. I sat by my apartment window that night, the city glowing beyond the glass, and realized the balance had shifted completely. Trevor had started this war thinking he could strip me of dignity, but by exposing the truth, I had turned his arrogance into his undoing. He thought silence would be my weakness. Instead, it became my strength. By the end of that week, Trevor's name had become a punchline across Dallas. His morning show theatrics, his crocodile tears, the leaked recordings, none of it had bought him sympathy. Still, I knew silence wasn't his nature. Trevor always needed an audience, and desperation made him reckless. When the phone rang late one night and his number flashed across the screen, I stared at it for a long moment. I didn't answer. I wanted him to feel what it was like to reach for someone and find nothing there. But the quiet after his calls only deepened the certainty inside me he wasn't going to fade. He was preparing for another scene. I didn't have to wait long. A few days later, I was invited to a charity dinner at one of the city's finest hotels, a place where deals were whispered over wine and appearances mattered as much as the cause itself. I hesitated before agreeing, worried that stepping back into the spotlight would give Trevor another opening. But something in me wanted to stand tall in the same circles where he once thrived. I chose a simple black gown, elegant but unpretentious, and walked into the ballroom knowing eyes would follow me. The clinking of glasses and the low murmur of conversation wrapped around the room like music. I almost allowed myself to relax. Then I saw him. Trevor stood near the bar, alone this time, his hair unkempt, his suit hanging just a little too loose. He caught sight of me immediately, straightening as though he'd rehearsed the moment. Within seconds, he raised his glass, his voice booming louder than necessary. "Grace! Whitmore, everyone! The woman who locked me out of my own life." His words cut through the room, laughter tumbling awkwardly after them. A dozen faces turned my way. Phones slid discreetly into hands. He had found his stage. I crossed the room, not rushing, not faltering, each step measured. When I reached him, I leaned on the edge of the bar, my voice calm. "Is this really the best you can do, Trevor? Public stunts in borrowed suits?" His smirk twitched, but he pressed on. "You're hoarding everything that should have been ours. You know it. Everyone here knows it. Don't act like the Angel of Dallas when you're nothing but a Whitmore name with a ledger." His words landed heavy, but this time, the sting didn't pierce me. I slipped my phone from my clutch again, opening a folder I had tucked away for moments just like this. I held the screen where he couldn't look away. It glowed with his own words, promises of money to Sloan, plans to drain accounts that weren't his. A hush spread across the room as a few people craned closer. "You mean these messages?" I asked softly. "Because if you'd like, I can read them aloud." Trevor's face blanched. Murmurs rippled outward, each one sharper than the last. His hand trembled as he set his glass down too quickly, the stem snapping in two. "You set me up," he whispered, voice tight. But I didn't whisper back. I straightened and let my voice carry. "The truth doesn't need a setup, Trevor. It only needs a little light. And you've given me more than enough material." Someone clapped softly from the corner, and the applause spread unevenly, some polite, some amused, but all of it pointed at him. He tried to speak again, but the weight of every eye silenced him. He gathered what was left of his pride, turned sharply, and stormed out of the ballroom. I let him go. Word of the confrontation spread by morning. Social media carried clips, hashtags multiplying like sparks. People weren't just laughing, now they were dissecting, turning his arrogance into entertainment. Memes of him snapping the wine glass appeared before I'd even finished my coffee. And then came the final blow I hadn't planned but welcomed all the same. One of his business partners released a formal statement. "We cannot align with conduct that disregards integrity. Effective immediately, Trevor Hale is no longer affiliated with our firm." I read the words twice, the corners of my mouth lifting. He wasn't just mocked now. He was professionally cut off, his name toxic in the circles he once worshipped. Still, he wasn't finished. 2 days later, he appeared outside the apartment building where I had moved with Maya. He shouted from the sidewalk, pounding on the air like he could summon me down. The doorman threatened to call the police, but I watched from the upstairs window, hidden behind the curtains. His hair stuck up at odd angles, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes darting wildly. He looked nothing like the man who once strutted beside me in tailored suits. He looked desperate, feral, even a man who had no more stages left. I didn't open the window. I let him shout into the night until his voice cracked. Then I turned away. The following morning, Arthur called. "We need to move forward formally," he said. "The prenup is our strongest weapon, but the evidence you've gathered will seal the rest." His calm steadied me. The time for quiet defiance was ending. The time for official dismantling was here. I agreed, knowing Trevor wouldn't surrender until a judge told him there was nothing left to fight for. That evening, I stacked the folders of text, receipts, and recordings neatly on my desk, each page another brick in the wall closing around him. Yet even as I prepared for the legal battles ahead, I couldn't shake the image of Trevor shouting under my window, his voice hoarse, his hands shaking. He had built his life on appearances, on the illusion of power. Now that illusion was stripped bare, and all that remained was a man clawing at shadows. I realized then that what he feared most wasn't losing me. It was losing the platform I had given him, simply by standing at his side. Without it, he was already unraveling. The day the process server delivered the papers, I knew there would be no turning back. Arthur had prepared everything with surgical precision: divorce filings, financial separation, full enforcement of the prenup. Trevor was served at the shabby apartment he had taken after being forced out of our home. Within minutes, he called me, his voice shaking with anger. "You can't do this to me," he shouted. "We can work this out privately." I hung up without answering. There would be no private discussions anymore. This wasn't just between us. This was between Trevor and the truth he had spent years running from. When the first hearing arrived, Trevor showed up in a navy suit that tried too hard to look pressed. He walked into the courtroom with his chin high, but the confidence cracked quickly. Our attorneys laid out the evidence: hotel receipts, photographs, recordings, every document that proved his betrayal. The judge's eyes scanned each piece in silence, her lips pressed thin in disapproval. When she finally looked up, she spoke directly to him. "Mr. Hale, your actions leave very little room for argument here." His jaw twitched, but he had no reply. The weight of the courtroom silenced the arrogance he once carried so easily. Piece by piece, the financial dismantling unfolded. The accounts I had already frozen were declared fully mine. The ranch property, the investments, even the car Trevor liked to parade through downtown, were confirmed under my sole name. He tried to argue that his sweat equity counted as contribution. The judge raised one brow and asked, "Do you have documentation of this equity?" He had none. Each attempt he made to salvage dignity collapsed under the weight of facts. By the end of the first month, he was living on borrowed money, maxed out credit cards, and favors that dried up almost as quickly as he asked for them. The collapse spread into his personal life, too. His older brother, who had quietly bailed him out more times than I knew, finally cut him off. "You humiliated our family," he told Trevor during a recess, his words flat and final. "You dragged our name through the mud, and you'll get no more from us." His parents didn't even come to court. I heard through acquaintances that they told friends they had no son by that name anymore. Harsh, perhaps, but Trevor had leaned on their forgiveness like a crutch for years. This time, he had burned it to ash. Sloan vanished soon after the hearings began. Rumors said she fled to Houston, back to working tables at a lounge where few people knew her story. The promises Trevor once made her, the condo, the car, the glamorous life, had evaporated. I almost pitied her when I thought of the crimson dress she wore the night she stormed into my birthday. Almost. But the truth was, she had chosen arrogance as her weapon, and now she was paying the price alongside him. The hearings dragged on for weeks, but each one stripped Trevor a little more. One afternoon, he appeared without a lawyer, clutching a battered folder, as though it could defend him. His former counsel had withdrawn after he failed to pay the retainer. The judge did not soften. "Mr. Hale," she said, her voice firm, "failure to retain representation does not excuse you from these proceedings. We move forward." He nodded, his face pale, but his hands shook as he opened his folder. Inside was little more than scattered notes and empty claims. Watching him scramble made the humiliation he once inflicted on me feel very far away. By the time the final ruling was read, Trevor had nothing left to cling to. No spousal support, no share of the assets, no access to property in my name. The Mercedes he once drove proudly was repossessed by court order, hauled away in front of him, while reporters snapped photographs. He stood in the parking lot, shoulders hunched, watching the tow truck pull away with what had once been his favorite prop. For a man who had built his identity on image, The sight was its own verdict. Yet it wasn't just money or property he lost. Socially, he had become radioactive. The same friends who once filled his nights with bar tabs and shallow compliments now avoided him. Business contacts ghosted him. At every public place he tried to appear, whispers followed him like shadows. The man who once craved attention now wore it like a curse. He had wanted to make me a cautionary tale, but instead, he had become one. Through all of it, I kept steady. I didn't gloat, didn't shout. I saved every voicemail he left, pleas for forgiveness, half-hearted apologies, angry threats, but I never answered them. I knew one day he might try to twist the story again, and I wanted the truth preserved in his own words. What tested me most wasn't his begging or his anger. It was when he tried to drag others into the fight. He claimed in court that he had been a father figure to Maya, that he deserved visitation rights because he had helped raise her. The judge shut him down quickly. "Parental rights are not assigned through marriage, Mr. Hale," she said, "and your behavior suggests you would not be a suitable guardian." I walked out of court that day with Maya's hand in mine, feeling freer than I had in months. At night, I would sit by the window of my new loft. The city lights spread out before me, and think about the man who once walked into parties beside me with his arm heavy around my waist. That man no longer existed. What remained was a shadow, a shell that had been hollowed by his own greed. And I no longer felt pity. The humiliation he had tried to bury me under now lived entirely in his reflection. When the judge's gavel came down and the courtroom emptied, I thought that was the end of it. But Trevor found me in the hallway before I could leave. His shoulders slumped, his voice low and desperate. He looked smaller somehow, as though the weight of his own mistakes had finally hollowed him out. "Grace," he said, "just give me 5 minutes. We had a life together. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" I stood with my back against the wall, listening. His words trembled with regret, but they carried the same pattern I had heard for years. Appeals that never matched his actions. I told him calmly that marriage had meant something to me once until he dragged a mistress into my birthday dinner and demanded my inheritance in front of my family. Love cannot survive where betrayal becomes routine. He flinched, running a hand through his disheveled hair, muttering promises he should have made years ago. But I didn't bend. What struck me in that moment wasn't his pleading. It was the realization that I no longer needed anything from him. I could stand on my own, and I always had. Trevor had mistaken my loyalty for weakness, my patience for dependence. But standing there in that quiet courthouse corridor, I knew with certainty that his downfall had been entirely his own. I straightened my shoulders, told him goodbye, and walked away without looking back. The sun outside was bright, almost blinding, and the noise of reporters faded into nothing as I slipped on my sunglasses and stepped into a life that finally belonged to me again. The months that followed felt like learning to breathe in fresh air after years of stale smoke. I moved into a loft downtown, nothing extravagant, but full of light and glass, a place that reflected who I had become. I threw myself into work with a new sense of freedom, taking the reins of the family businesses, making decisions without compromise or excuses. Under my care, the ranch and investments grew stronger than ever, and I started a foundation in my parents' names to support education in rural communities. It felt good to give back, to build something steady and lasting from the ashes of what had nearly destroyed me. At home, life was quieter, and that quiet was a gift. Mornings began with coffee on the balcony and the sound of Maya's laughter filling the apartment. Evenings were slower, steadier, full of simple joys, like reading together or sharing stories my parents once told me. Nate visited often, his steady presence a reminder that family built on loyalty will always outweigh the false promises of outsiders. For the first time in years, peace settled over my days like a soft blanket, and I let myself rest in it. Every now and then, Trevor's name surfaced. A friend mentioned seeing him at a rundown bar ranting to anyone who would listen, his credit long gone and his reputation in ruins. Someone else said he was sleeping on couches out of work and out of allies. I didn't feel pity anymore. He had written his own ending long before the courts stamped it into paper. Actions have consequences, and his had finally caught up with him. Looking back, I realized betrayal had once felt like it would break me, but it had only stripped away what I didn't need. What remained was strength, clarity, and freedom. Trevor thought humiliation would destroy me, but it became the forge that sharpened me instead. My dignity had not been lost in that dining room. It had been waiting for me to claim it again. The lesson I carried forward was simple, though not easy. You cannot let someone else define your worth, no matter how long you've stood beside them. Loyalty means nothing without respect, and love without honesty is only a performance. Sometimes the greatest act of courage is walking away, not in anger, but in certainty that your life deserves more than betrayal. I often think of my parents, of the legacy they left me. It wasn't just land and ledgers, though those mattered too. It was the reminder that strength can be quiet, that dignity doesn't have to be shouted. It can be lived in steady choices, in calm defiance, in refusing to surrender, even when you feel stripped bare. That's what carried me through, and that's what I will pass on to Maya so she knows her worth can never be stolen by someone else's greed. Before we close, I'd love to know if you've faced betrayal or found your way back to dignity. Which part of this journey spoke most to you? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you'd like to hear more true family stories, stay connected here.